From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. For President Trump, it's been a busy few days. First brokering a ceasefire, then watching it burn. And then trying to salvage it from the flames with, I should warn you, his customary colourful language.
Israel, as soon as we made the deal, they came out and they dropped a load of bombs, the likes of which I'd never seen before. The biggest load that we've seen. I'm not happy with Israel. I'm not happy with Iran either. We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
It was quite a change in tone from earlier in the week, when President Trump seemed to relish the idea of what war with Iran might bring.
In a post on social media, Trump said it's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change?
He's not the only one who's been talking up the prospect of regime change. Benjamin Netanyahu had a message of his own for the Iranian people.
I wish to speak to you, the proud people of Iran. The time has come for you to unite around your flag by standing up for your freedom from an evil and oppressive regime. It has never been weaker. This is your opportunity to stand up and let your voices be heard.
But how has the Israeli and American campaign of bombing been seen inside Iran? Will it trigger regime change, or could it backfire, strengthening the regime at home? And what can the history of Iran teach us about attempts by foreign countries to influence its future? The story today: is Iran heading for regime change?
My name is Mosul Melani, and I'm a professor of politics at the University of South Florida. I am the author of a recently published book on Iran's rise and rivalry with the United States in the Middle East, in which I discuss Iranian foreign policy, regional policy toward Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and the Palestinian organizations.
What was your reaction when you heard about the bombing? You know, for many Iranians, I suppose the prospect of war with the West is something that they've dreaded for years.
My academic life, my writings, my interviews were all devoted to one major goal. I wanted to prevent a war between Iran and the West. I have been one of the outspoken supporters of a balanced Iranian foreign policy based on good relationship with the US and US allies, as well as with Europe and with Russia and China. So when Israel launched this attack, I was surprised. But then when the US got involved, that's when I really started not only getting surprised, getting worried. Because as far as I know, this is the first time that the US has attacked the Iranian homeland. I don't remember the US ever attacking Iran, and it worried me quite a bit.
It's very hard to know the unintended consequences of any of this, how any of it might end. Do you think, as part of that process, though, is there a genuine possibility right now that the regime in Iran as we know it could come to an end during this process?
One of the things I learned as an academic is that people who are sure about the future either don't know history or are ignorant of the present. I'm not going to make any judgment about what is going to happen a year from now. Remember, I was talking about unintended consequences. That applies for the Western governments as well as applies to the Islamic Republic. What I can tell you with some degree of certainty, as of today, I have not seen any evidence of the regime collapse. The Islamic Republic is not a one-man show. Iran has many different centers of power. What they are going to do in the next few months is anybody's guess. However, at this time, I don't see that the state is disintegrating. I think that was the hope of the Israelis, that once they eliminate the top leadership, the system is going to collapse. Secondly, inside Iran, I think it's going to be very difficult for any regime to take over as the country is being attacked. I think if they do, they're going to lack legitimacy. Therefore, we have to wait and see what happens after a ceasefire. I think whenever your country is attacked, people usually tend to rally behind the flag. Yeah. That's natural instinct.
In the center of the crowd, Iran's president, surrounded by hundreds of party faithful, venting their fury at the United States. Domestic public opinion is now divided and confused.
The response must be firm and decisive. What's at stake here is the very identity of being Iranian.
In my opinion, Iran needs to engage in some reflection and contemplation.
Here is what I think a lot of people are worried about. Iran, next to Iran, is Afghanistan. We had 20 years of American occupation in Afghanistan. The occupation started with the overthrow of the Taliban, and the occupation ended with the Taliban in power. Now, Iranians are not stupid. That occupation didn't bring democracy. It ruined the country. And the Taliban are still there. They look at Iraq. They hated Saddam Hussein, but Iraq was a stable country, and it had one of the largest and most educated middle classes in the Middle East. Look what happened there. They look at Syria. Look what has happened to Syria. Look what happened to the Arab Spring. Look what happened in Egypt. A government was overthrown, the Muslim Brotherhood took over, and then the same government that was overthrown came back and has become not more liberal, but definitely much less liberal. Therefore, this middle class, those people in between, are perhaps ready for change, but they want to see a visible alternative that is not going to turn Iran into a new Afghanistan, new Lebanon, new Iraq. And that's how they are looking at this situation at the present time.
That's so interesting. So looking at their neighbors, there are a lot of lessons there about how regime change can go very wrong. Mohsen, you're an expert not only on the Iranian regime, but also on many of its proxies. This attack, firstly from Israel and then followed up by the Americans, came after months of assassinations and attacks that have hugely weakened many of those proxies. We've seen Hezbollah have most of its leadership decapitated. We've seen the Houthis be hit by American bombs. How much can the Iranians still cause trouble if they want to in response to what's happened?
I think your analysis of the situation is correct. But may I just add something to it? When the Shah of Iran was overthrown in 1979, Iran was at the height of its power in the Middle East. The problem with the Shah was that he had lost a considerable degree of popular support. Today, the Islamic Republic is facing the same thing. Iran has lost considerable degree of its power. In Lebanon, Syria is gone. The fall of Assad, I think, was much more important than anything else for Iran. But Iran still does have some degree of support inside Iraq, and I think definitely with the Houthis in Yemen. And they might be able to revive this should we get involved in a regional conflict. We're dealing with a fluid situation, but Iran is still capable of fomenting trouble in the region, relying on acts of terrorism, kidnapping, attacking American embassies. There are all kinds of stuff. Or they can close the Strait of Hormuz. I don't think they have the military capability to close it, however. If Iran just makes that threat and starts implementing it, it's going to become very effective if at the same time the Houthis in Yemen join Iran to make shipping very difficult. Is going to disrupt world economy and it's going to increase the price of oil.
So Iran could still unleash chaos on the global economy if it wants to. But how strong is the regime feeling at home? How are Iranians reacting to the US and Israeli strikes? I've been speaking to Fatemeh Jamalpour, a journalist who's living in exile in the United States. She had to leave Iran in a hurry after being arrested for reporting on the women's protests against the government.
I just watching the videos of my favorite streets in Tehran got hit by Israel bombs, and I was just watching all the news in disbelief.
Benjamin Netanyahu stood up and did a speech saying that these bombings were an opportunity for Iranian people to rise up against the regime. Is that what you thought?
So I talked to many people from all generations, and they are repeating that you cannot bomb us and asking us to go to the street and protest. And I'll say that the regime change would not happen from the war. We know that Netanyahu and none of those politicians are talking on behalf of my people.
After that initial series of attacks, we had Donald Trump wading in. We had the Americans bombing nuclear sites. What did people say about that?
People were shocked. The first national reaction was fear of radioactivity spreading. People just circulating about how to deal and face with radioactivity, close your window, close your door, save drinking water, all of these things. And it was the huge wave of fear, and all the people saying that they waste the country resources and everything for the nuclear program, that we didn't want that. The majority of people do not want nuclear program. Then people talking about a national humiliation by the US joining the Israel and attacking.
Even though they don't like the nuclear program, they see this as a humiliation.
Yeah, it's occupation country. It's not according to any, international law.
Fatemeh, after the bombs landed on the nuclear sites, Israel followed up with an attack which took the doors off Evin prison.
This just in from the Associated Press. They say breaking: the gate of Iran's notorious Evin prison in Tehran is hit in a suspected Israeli strike. This coming from Iranian state television. They go on to say, quote, Evin prison is known for holding dual nationals and Westerners, often used by Iran as bargaining chips in negotiations with the West.
This is a prison where political prisoners, people who try to rise us against the regime, had been held. How did people view that? Did that change the narrative at all?
First, we don't call it Evin prison. We call it Evin University due to high number of intellectual, writer, journalists, documentary, all the proposition that the regime keep there. When they hit that, people were worried for their beloved one who imprisonment. We don't think that Israel gonna to help. No prisoner escaped. They didn't hit the door. They hit the facilities. It makes more escape for the people who are in the cell and have no way to, escape.
People hopeful that these attacks have weakened the regime and it might fall. Is there any hope of that, or are people just angry about these attacks?
People are thinking that this attack make regime more weak and angry, and then the Israel and the US will leave Iranian people with the angry regime that is going to take revenge from Iranian people and civilian and opposition. People don't think that they will bring regime change.
So there's real fear.
Yeah, they are more scared of the more angry regime.
I suppose to really understand how a Western intervention like this, America bombing on behalf of Israel, will be met in Iran, we probably need to look back at the history. So just very briefly, take us back to 1953 and just remind us of what Britain and America were doing in Iran.
Thank you for that excellent question, because we often fixate on current events and analyze them in isolation. Since at least 1905, when Iran established its first written constitution, Iranians have been striving for democracy. They have been trying to establish a rule-based system in Iran. And they also tried to remain politically independent. Let me fast forward to 1953. At that moment, there was an Iranian nationalist by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh, a French-educated aristocrat from the Qajar family and anti-communist.
And democratically elected.
Yes, absolutely. He came out with an idea that we need to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. The Iranian oil industry was under British control since 1907, when oil was first discovered in the barren desert of Iran by a British company. And the British had complete control over the Iranian oil industry. He said, we need to nationalize Iranian oil company, not just because of its economic importance. He said, as long as the British control how much money we get from our oil, they can manipulate Iranian politics, and therefore one of the key goals of the constitutional movement, which was protection of Iranian sovereignty, is going to be a farce. And therefore what we need to do is to nationalize it. And that he did, and then we entered into a conflict with the British, and the story is long. He kicked the British diplomats out of the country. And then, of course, by 1953, when there was a change of government in America, President Truman was receptive to the idea of nationalization, but wanted the Iranians to compensate the British. Mossadegh didn't agree with this plan. I think he should have, but he didn't agree with this plan. But then when General Eisenhower came, and we began to see the beginning of the Cold War, Eisenhower, pushed by Winston Churchill, who had a personal dislike of Mohammad Mossadegh, together they began to see the situation in Iran very differently. They didn't care about this nationalistic sentiment that the Iranians were expressing. Their concern was the Cold War. So the British succeeded in persuading Eisenhower that, look, Mossadegh is a threat to our interests in the region, economic interests, because if he succeeds in nationalizing Iranian oil, other countries could follow suit, but also his policies could end up empowering the Soviets in Iran. And that's how, together, they decided to overthrow Mossadegh.
In 1953, the United States, together with Britain, participated in a coup in Iran that got rid of Mossadegh.
Mossadegh and his government were swept from power in favor of General Zahedi. 300 killed and hundreds wounded is a conservative estimate.
And then, of course, the U.S. became the dominant power in Iran. Fast forward to 1979, there is an Islamic revolution.
There might have been tears in the eyes of the Shah as he left Iran for what could be the last time. But there was nothing but sheer delight on the faces of the demonstrators who took to the streets of the capital in their thousands.
Victory will not only be the abdication of the dynasty, but also the end of the foreign domination. And this is more important.
Then there is the hostage crisis.
It started when Iranians stormed the U.S. embassy, furious that the U.S. gave the deposed Shah of Iran medical sanctuary. In the frantic moments before the embassy buildings fell, Moorfield hustled 5 Americans out who ended up in the Canadian embassy. their escape from Iran portrayed in the movie Argo.
At a cemetery in Hermitage, Pennsylvania, an American flag is raised to mark yet another day in which U.S. hostages are held captive. It's a ceremony that's been held here since day one of the Iranian crisis.
And the alliance between Iran and the United States ended, and unfortunately, regrettably, Iran became engaged in a Cold War against the U.S. and made anti-Americanism the foundation, and anti-Israel the foundation of its foreign policy.
And how much have those events, has that interference from Britain and America to change a democratically elected government into something they preferred? How much has that had a lasting impact on the way Western interventions are seen in Iran?
A great deal. When Mossadegh was overthrown, before that happened, the United States was a very popular country in Iran. Mossadegh, until he was overthrown, he admired the U.S. He went to Washington and met with American officials. But after he was overthrown, the U.S. lost its popularity in Iran. But then the coup came, and the coup d'etat changed the mental orientation of Iranian nationalists and many young Iranians. For one reason, the Shah was tainted as somebody who was serving American, British interest in Iran rather than Iranian interest. And that, I think, was the key ideological element of the Islamic Revolution of 1979.
At the moment, people are questioning how long the current regime will last. If it does fall as a result of American and Israeli action, who's waiting in the wings? You know, that we know that there have been several attempts at revolutions. We saw the Green Revolution come and go, and there's been so much force used against any kind of opposition in Iran. I suppose most people are wondering what's left. Is there a democratic movement waiting in the wings?
Well, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people waiting, but just because you're waiting doesn't mean you're going to get there. But I can think of a number of scenarios. One scenario is that things are going to get so nasty that we are going to see one segment of the IRGC taking over the country, declaring martial law. We have a military government, and ultimately we are going to see something similar to what we have in Pakistan, where the military and the intelligence actually run the show, even if they have elections. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that we're going to have a new supreme leader, somebody who's much more flexible and willing to change the system. That would be, I would call it, the Mohammed bin Salman's model in Iran, that we're going to have somebody younger who's willing to give a great deal of freedom to Iranians, personal freedom, civil liberties, and he's going to say, look, we need to change the orientation of our domestic and foreign policy.
So a modernizer, as we've seen in Saudi Arabia.
A modern, yes. Another possibility, and I think we should not underestimate that possibility, is a failed state, a weakened government in Tehran that is being undermined by separatist movements in Kurdistan, in Baluchistan, and even around Azerbaijan or other segments, and unable to keep the country totally unified, but still powerful enough to maintain order in Tehran. But that would be, to me, a failed state. There is another possibility of a civil war, i.e. the model of what is still going on in Syria today, and it's going to be nasty. But then there is also three other possibilities. One is we have a number of very prominent Iranians who have been imprisoned for the past few years. Some of them used to work for the Islamic Republic, some of them have not. And should the state begin to collapse, they could come and serve an important role as a transitional leader. Finally, there are two outside organizations. One is Mujahideen Khalq, MEK.
They helped topple the Shah during the 1979 Iranian Revolution, calling themselves the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, or the Holy Warriors of the People.
They were one of the most violent and militant groups in Iran in the 1970s. But then they lost out in the power struggle that occurred during and after the revolution. They committed some spectacular terrorist attacks. They blew up parliament. They killed a number of senior Iranian officials, and they had to flee.
The Mujahideen-e-Khalq, I think, today are the most organized political opposition outside Iran. The problem with Mujahideen is that they sided with Iraq during Iran-Iraq war. And they don't have, again, I could be completely wrong, and for an academic to say, I don't know something is very painful, but I don't know how much support they have. My guess is that they don't, but they do have a very good organization. They are supported by a good number of Western politicians, and they are very resilient. And then finally, we have former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi.
I am stepping forward to lead this national transition, not out of personal interest, but as a servant of the Iranian people.
He has incredible degree of support in social media. Based on my conversation with many Iranians outside Iran, I have not been in contact with Iranians inside Iran since this whole thing started. My guess is that he does have some degree of support inside Iran, although it is very difficult to predict this. But he does have one thing that no other Iranian leader, those who are seeking to take over the government, and that's name recognition.
46 years ago, when my late father and our family were forced to leave Iran, I took an oath to God and to my country. I would not turn my back on Iran or the Iranian people. Every day since, I have dedicated my life to my compatriots.
There are a lot of Iranians who remember Iran prior to 1979 and have good memories. The problem is, can he turn that visibility and name recognition into an organization that operates inside Iran? Without having an organization, without having foot soldiers inside Iran, it's going to be very difficult to overthrow the Islamic Republic.
Mohsen, for you, as somebody who understands Iran, has watched it so closely for so long, what are your greatest hopes and fears for this moment?
My greatest hope at this moment is that for Iran and the US to begin direct negotiation, for Iran to realize that their foreign policy has not produced the kind of benefit they were hoping for, that it is high time for a new orientation in Iranian foreign policy. My greatest fear is a failed Iranian state. It is not going to be good for the country. People don't realize that. They really think that this transition is going to be very smooth. But I ask them to rethink this and look at other transitions in that region. Iran does have an old civilization, correct. Iran does have national cohesion, like no other country in that region. But war has its own logic, it has its own dynamic, and it is unpredictable. They should think about it twice.
That was Mosul Melani, Professor of Politics at the University of South Florida and the author of Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the United States and the Middle East. We also heard from the Iranian exile and journalist Fatemeh Jamalpour. For all the latest on the situation in the Middle East, follow the live coverage at thetimes.com or listen to regular updates on Times Radio. The producer today was Shabnam Grewal. The executive producer was Molly Guinness. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.